The air was a razor, thin and lethally cold. Below, a sheer drop of 1,000 feet fell away into a chasm of jagged, ice-encrusted rock. An impassable wall of stone, freshly exposed by a landslide, blocked the narrow path. The army, a river of half-frozen men and strange, monstrous beasts, ground to a halt. A murmur of despair rippled through the ranks. They were trapped between a mountain they could not climb and an enemy they could not fight. The gods themselves seemed to have barred the way. The invasion and everyone in it was doomed to become a frozen monument to hubris. At stake on this frozen precipice was more than just an army. It was the culmination of a sacred vow, the final act in a multi-generational vendetta against the world's rising superpower. If this army perished here, the dream of avenging a past humiliation would die with it. An empire's last, best hope would be extinguished, and its hated rival would be free to dominate the known world unopposed. The entire course of Western civilization hinged on whether this single, insurmountable rock could be moved. Survival was victory, and failure was oblivion. At the head of this frozen column of despair stood a man with one eye, the other lost to infection in a swamp weeks earlier. He did not see an obstacle, he saw a puzzle. While his men saw the end of the world, he saw only physics and engineering. He was the commander, the strategist, the living embodiment of his nation's will to survive. He was a nightmare given flesh, a specter from a hated land, and he was about to command his men to build a bonfire on a cliff face at the top of the world. How did it come to this? How did this Carthaginian general, with his army of Africans, Spaniards, and Gauls, and his terrifying war elephants, find himself stranded in the highest reaches of the Alps, a place no army had ever dared to cross? Why would any sane commander choose this impossible, suicidal route to invade the heartland of the Roman Republic? What was the name of this legendary feat of arms, and will that would terrify Rome to its core and echo through eternity? The answer is Hannibal's crossing of the Alps. And the immediate aftermath of that moment on the cliff was an act of pure, audacious genius. For days his men cut down trees, building a colossal pyre against the rock. When it was white-hot, they doused it with sour wine, the acidic liquid cracking the superheated stone. Soldiers then attacked the fractured rock with iron tools, chipping away a path wide enough for a man, a mule, and eventually a war elephant. Hannibal did not go around the mountain, he remade it. To understand this act of impossible defiance, we must go back a generation. The story begins not in the mountains, but in the bitter ashes of defeat. In the First Punic War, Carthage, the great maritime power of North Africa, was humiliated by the upstart Roman Republic. Stripped of its islands, its navy, and forced to pay crippling reparations, a deep and abiding hatred took root. Rome was an existential threat, a cancer that had to be excised before it consumed everything. From this defeat rose one family, the Barcas. The patriarch Hannibal Barca, a brilliant general, was forced to sign the peace he despised. Legend tells us that he took his 9-year-old son to the temple of Baal Hammon in Carthage. There, before a sacred altar, he made the boy place his hand on the sacrificial offering and swear a solemn oath. As long as he lived, he would never be a friend of Rome. That boy's name was Hannibal. Hannibal inherited his father's genius and his burning hatred. After Hamilcar's death, Hannibal took command of the Carthaginian forces in Hispania, modern Spain. He was not merely a soldier, he was a leader of men, capable of inspiring fanatical loyalty in a diverse, multinational army. He spent years forging this force into the finest fighting machine in the world, conquering Spanish tribes and building a new, wealthy power base for Carthage, all with one singular, undeclared purpose, the eventual destruction of Rome. The breaking point, the casus belli, came at the city of Saguntum. A Roman ally on the Spanish coast, the city stood as a buffer, a line in the sand drawn by Rome. Hannibal, in a direct act of defiance, laid siege to it. For 8 months he battered the city, eventually taking it by storm. It was a calculated provocation. Rome sent an embassy to Carthage demanding they hand over Hannibal for punishment. Carthage refused. The Roman envoy dramatically clutched his toga and declared, "I bring you war or peace, choose." The Carthaginians roared back, "Give us which you please." War was on. The Roman plan was simple, arrogant, and logical. They were the masters of the sea. They would fight the war on their own terms. One consular army led by Publius Cornelius Scipio would sail to Hispania to confront Hannibal there. Another, led by Tiberius Sempronius Longus, would sail to Sicily to prepare for a direct invasion of Carthage in Africa. They expected to corner the beast in its lair. They never once imagined the beast would come to them. Hannibal's strategy was the single most audacious military gamble in ancient history. He would not wait for Rome to attack. He would not fight them in Spain or in Africa. He would do what was considered physically impossible. He would take his entire army, infantry, cavalry, and his 37 war elephants on a 1,500-kilometer overland march. He would cross the Pyrenees, traverse southern Gaul, ford the mighty Rhone River, and then, most impossibly, he would cross the snow-covered peaks of the Alps to descend into Italy from the north. The journey began in the spring of 218 BC. His army was a testament to the Carthaginian mercenary system: tough Libyan infantry, elite Numidian light cavalry who rode without saddles or bridles, fierce Spanish swordsmen, and agile slingers from the Balearic Islands. It was a force of nearly 90,000 infantry and 12,000 cavalry. They left their new capital of New Carthage and marched north, their one-eyed commander at their head, his sworn oath burning in his heart. The world was about to change forever. The first great barrier was the Pyrenees Mountains. While not as formidable as the Alps, they were home to hostile Celtic tribes who resisted his passing. He fought his way through, but the cost was high, not just in battle casualties, but in desertions from Spanish troops unwilling to leave their homeland for a seemingly insane quest. He dismissed thousands more, preferring a smaller, more loyal force. By the time he reached the Rhone River, his army was significantly reduced, but leaner and more committed. The crossing of the Rhone was a masterclass in logistics and ingenuity. The local Gallic tribes were hostile, massed on the far bank to oppose him. Hannibal sent a detachment on a long flanking march to cross upstream undetected. While the main force built rafts and dug out canoes, the flanking force attacked the Gauls from the rear, sowing chaos. In the confusion, Hannibal's army made its crossing. The Romans under Scipio arrived at the river mouth just days too late, stunned to find that Hannibal was not in Spain, but had vanished to the east. Getting the elephants across the river was a unique challenge. The terrified beasts refused to board the flimsy rafts. Hannibal's engineers built enormous piers out into the river, covered them with earth to resemble solid ground, and then attached huge rafts to the end. The elephants were lured onto the piers and then onto the rafts, which were then cut loose. Some panicked and fell in, but their trunks allowed them to breathe as they were guided to the far shore. It was an omen of the creative thinking that would define the entire campaign. Now the true enemy appeared. Not men, but mountains. The Alps loomed before them, a terrifying wall of white and gray, the walls of Italy, as Hannibal called them. His soldiers, men from the warm climates of Africa and Spain, looked upon the snow-covered peaks with dread. Autumn was closing in, and the first snows of winter were already beginning to fall. The local Gallic guides they had hired warned them that the passes would soon be impassable. There was no turning back. The ascent was a nightmare. The narrow paths were treacherous, wide enough for only one man or animal at a time. Hostile mountain tribes, the Allobroges, shadowed their march. They waited until the long Carthaginian column was stretched thin in a narrow gorge, then they attacked. They rolled massive boulders down from the heights, crushing men and pack animals, sending them screaming into the chasms below. The elephants, trumpeting in terror, created more chaos, but their fearsome appearance also helped to scare off some of the attackers. The fighting in the passes was brutal and unlike anything his veterans had ever experienced. It was a vertical battle. Hannibal led a detachment to seize the high ground and managed to drive off the Gauls, but the losses were severe. He captured one of their towns, seizing enough food for a few days, but the psychological toll was immense. This was not a glorious battle against Roman legions. This was a desperate, ugly struggle for survival against a landscape that wanted them dead. After 9 days of climbing, they reached the summit. A heavy snow had fallen, covering the landscape and making the path treacherous. The morale of the army was at its breaking point. They were exhausted, starving, and half frozen. It was here that Hannibal delivered one of the most famous speeches in military history. He gathered his officers and pointed south, towards the hazy, indistinct plains below. He told them they were looking at the fertile Po Valley, at Italy. "You are now climbing over the walls not only of Italy," he declared, "but of Rome itself." His words gave them heart, but the ordeal was far from over. The descent proved to be even more deadly than the climb. The path on the Italian side was steeper, and the snow had been melted by the sun and refrozen into a sheet of sheer ice overnight. Men and animals lost their footing, sliding uncontrollably into the abyss. The new snow concealed deep crevasses. The army was in a state of controlled, agonizing freefall. It was during this hellish descent that they encountered the great landslide that blocked their path, the moment of near-total despair. For 3 agonizing days, the starving army worked to clear a path, using Hannibal's ingenious method of fire and vinegar to shatter the rock. While they worked, the surviving elephants, emaciated and weak, were on the verge of starvation, as there was no fodder for them at that altitude. The survival of the entire expedition came down to this single engineering feat. Finally, after 15 brutal days in the mountains, the survivors stumbled out of the foothills and into the plains of northern Italy. They were a horrifying sight. The historian Polybius, who had access to Carthaginian records, gives the stark numbers. Of the army that crossed the Rhone, only 12,000 African infantry, 8,000 Spanish infantry, and 6,000 cavalry remained. A mere 26,000 men. Only a few of the elephants had survived. They were not a conquering army, they were ghosts, skeletons draped in rags. When news reached Rome that Hannibal was in Italy, it was met with disbelief, then shock, and finally contempt. The Romans, supremely confident in their legions, saw this remnant of an army as little more than a band of desperate brigands. Scipio, having returned from the Rhone, took command of the legions in the north and marched to meet him, expecting to easily annihilate the exhausted invaders. He had no concept of the man he was about to face. The first clash came at the Ticinus River. It was a cavalry skirmish, but it was decisive. Hannibal's veteran Spanish and elite Numidian cavalry shattered their Roman counterparts. Scipio himself was gravely wounded and saved only by the bravery of his teenage son, the future Scipio Africanus. It was a small battle, but it was a stunning psychological blow to the Romans and announced Hannibal's arrival in a way no messenger could. The next major battle was at the Trebia River. The Roman consul Sempronius Longus, arrogant and eager for glory, was lured into a trap. On a bitterly cold December morning, Hannibal sent his Numidian cavalry to harass the Roman camp, provoking them into crossing the freezing Trebia River to give battle. The Romans charged across, cold, wet, and hungry. They met Hannibal's main line, and just as the battle was joined, a hidden force of 2,000 men under Hannibal's brother Mago burst from concealment and attacked the Roman rear. It was a complete rout. 2 Roman legions were annihilated. The disaster at Trebia sent a shockwave through Rome. They had lost 2 battles and a consular army. This was no mere raid. They raised new legions for the next year. The new consul Gaius Flaminius, a populist and aggressive commander, marched his army north to block Hannibal's path to central Italy. Hannibal, ever unpredictable, did not take the main road. He led his army on a grueling 4-day march through the supposedly impassable Arno marshes, a move that cost him the sight in his right eye, but allowed him to bypass the Roman army completely. Hannibal was now rampaging through Etruria, in the heart of Italy, with a Roman army chasing him. Flaminius, enraged, pursued recklessly. Hannibal found the perfect location for another trap, a narrow defile along the northern shore of Lake Trasimene, with hills rising steeply from the water's edge. On a foggy morning, he concealed his entire army in the wooded hillsides overlooking the road. The Roman army marched directly into the trap. As the head of the Roman column made contact with Hannibal's blocking force, the main Carthaginian army descended from the hills, attacking the long, exposed flank of the Roman line. The fog muffled the sounds, and the Romans had no idea what was happening until it was too late. Hemmed in between the lake and the hills, they were systematically slaughtered. 15,000 Romans were killed, including the consul Flaminius. It remains the largest ambush in military history. The news of Lake Trasimene plunged Rome into absolute terror. The phrase Hannibal ad portas, Hannibal is at the gates, became a fearful cry used to frighten children for centuries. The Republic, facing an existential crisis, resorted to an emergency measure, the appointment of a dictator. They chose Quintus Fabius Maximus, an old, cautious aristocrat. Fabius recognized a terrifying truth: in a pitched battle, Rome could not defeat Hannibal. He would not even try. Fabius instituted a new, deeply unpopular strategy that would earn him the nickname Cunctator, the delayer. The Fabian strategy was a war of attrition. The Roman army would shadow Hannibal's forces, harassing his foragers, cutting off his supply lines, and attacking isolated detachments. They would refuse to be drawn into a major battle, no matter the provocation. It was a militarily sound but politically disastrous strategy, as Hannibal was free to burn and pillage the Italian countryside with impunity. After Fabius's term expired, Rome, tired of his delaying tactics, returned to its old ways. They elected 2 new consuls and raised the largest army in the Republic's history, 8 full legions, perhaps 80,000 men. They were determined to meet Hannibal in a single, decisive battle and crush him through sheer weight of numbers. In 216 BC, near a supply depot called Cannae in southern Italy, they found him. What happened at Cannae was Hannibal's masterpiece. He faced a Roman army almost twice his size. He deliberately placed his weakest troops, his Gallic and Spanish infantry, in the center of his line, which he advanced in a crescent shape. The Romans, as he knew they would, charged forward, easily pushing back the weak Carthaginian center. But this was the bait. As the Roman legions pressed deeper, Hannibal's elite African infantry on the flanks held firm, then wheeled inwards, attacking the exposed sides of the Roman formation. At the same time, Hannibal's superior cavalry, having driven off their Roman counterparts, swept around and attacked the Roman rear, completely encircling the massive army. The trap was sprung. Packed so tightly they could barely swing their swords, the Roman soldiers were systematically butchered for hours. By the end of the day, as many as 70,000 Romans lay dead on the field. It was the single bloodiest day in Roman history, a military masterclass in tactics and a catastrophe of unimaginable scale. In one afternoon, Hannibal had wiped out the entire Roman ruling class. His impossible journey over the Alps had led to this, the moment where the Roman Republic was brought to the very brink of utter destruction.